The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m. at Memorial Hospital. The night shift was in full swing, with the emergency room finally catching a brief moment of calm after hours of non-stop activity. A dedicated nurse was gathering his things from his locker, his dark blue scrubs showing traces of the demanding 12-hour shift he'd just completed. His shoulders felt heavy, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his heart. They'd saved 3 lives today. Rain drummed steadily against the hospital windows as he signed out, exchanging tired smiles with the incoming night staff. The autumn weather had turned particularly nasty, with wind whipping the trees and creating that distinctive whisper howl through the parking structure. He pulled his jacket closer, already dreaming of his warm bed waiting at home. The hospital parking lot was mostly empty now, just a scatter of cars belonging to the night shift staff. His footsteps echoed as he walked to his car, an older but well-maintained sedan that had faithfully carried him through countless shifts over the years. The dashboard clock glowed 11:45 p.m. as he settled into the driver's seat, letting out a long breath and taking a moment to just sit there, allowing the day's intense moments to fade away. As he drove out of the parking structure, the wipers pushing away the heavy rain, his headlights swept across something that made him slow down. At the bus stop just outside the hospital grounds, a figure stood huddled under a small umbrella that was clearly losing its battle with the wind. Even through the rain-streaked windshield, he could make out the distinctive light blue scrubs of the respiratory therapy department. He noticed her checking her phone repeatedly, her body language showing increasing frustration. The bus stop's dim lighting barely illuminated the schedule posted there, but he knew the late-night buses often ran behind schedule in this weather, if they came at all. His fingers tapped thoughtfully on the steering wheel as he approached the intersection. The responsible thing would be to just drive on home. That's what everyone had always told him, don't stop for strangers, especially at night. His own experiences had taught him that people could be quick to judge, to assume the worst, particularly about a black man offering help after dark. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was because he could see her hospital ID badge catching the light, just like his own. Maybe it was because he knew exactly how it felt to stand there after a long shift, watching your ride home disappear into uncertainty. Or maybe it was simply because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone from his hospital family being stranded in this weather. The traffic light turned red, giving him a moment to really think. Through the passenger window, he could see her more clearly now. She was trying to shield her phone from the rain, probably attempting to call a ride service. Her scrubs were getting soaked despite the umbrella, and she kept anxiously looking down the empty street. His mother had raised him to help people in need. It was why he'd become a nurse in the first place. But she'd also taught him to be careful, to protect himself in a world that didn't always give black men the benefit of the doubt. As the rain grew heavier and the wind picked up, he watched her umbrella finally give up and flip inside out. That settled it. He couldn't just drive away. Sometimes being human meant taking a chance on kindness, even when experience suggested otherwise. As the light turned green, he made his decision, carefully pulling his car toward the curb, making sure to stop at a respectful distance from the bus stop. He lowered the passenger window just enough to be heard over the rain, his hospital ID badge clearly visible on his jacket. What happened next would change not just this rainy night, but the lives of many people in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He took a deep breath as he lowered the passenger window, raindrops sprinkling onto the car seat. "Hey there," he called out, keeping his voice gentle and professional. "I work in the ER. Looks like the bus isn't coming anytime soon in this weather. Could I offer you a ride?" The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. How many times had he driven past people at bus stops, telling himself it wasn't safe to stop? But tonight was different. He could see her shivering, her thin scrubs offering little protection against the biting wind. Her umbrella was completely ruined now, hanging limply at her side like a defeated soldier. She hesitated, peering through the rain at his car. He understood that hesitation all too well. It lived in the same place as his own doubts, that careful space where trust wrestled with caution. Rather than push, he waited patiently, engine humming quietly. He gestured to his hospital ID badge, still hanging from his rearview mirror. "I noticed your scrubs. I know how tough these late shifts can be, especially when the weather's like this." He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to project the same calm he used with nervous patients in the ER. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the car roof like impatient fingers. A sudden gust of wind sent a spray of water across the bus stop, and she let out a small gasp as the cold droplets hit her face. Her phone screen had gone dark, probably the battery finally giving up. He watched as she glanced up and down the empty street. No other cars in sight, no sign of the bus, and rideshare prices would be surging in this weather if you could even get one to come out. The nearest taxi stand was 20 minutes away by foot. His own history played through his mind as he waited. The suspicious glances when he was just trying to help someone with their groceries. The way some people crossed the street when they saw him approaching, even in his scrubs. The times he'd been told he didn't look like a nurse. Each memory was a lesson in caution, a reminder of why many people in his position would have just driven past. But his grandmother's words echoed louder than those memories. Fear can make us forget our humanity, baby. But every time you choose kindness over fear, you make the world a little bit better. She'd lived through times when kindness was a revolutionary act, and she'd never let fear steal her compassion. The respiratory therapist took a small step toward the car, then stopped. He could see the internal debate playing across her face, the same one he'd just had with himself. Trust versus caution, humanity versus fear. He noticed her hospital ID card, clipped to her scrub pocket, remembered seeing her around the hospital though they'd never spoken. "Look," he said softly, "I completely understand if you're not comfortable. No pressure at all. I just couldn't drive away knowing a fellow healthcare worker was stranded here. If you prefer, I can call hospital security to give you a ride. They do that sometimes for staff." Something in his voice must have resonated with her, that tone that comes from years of caring for others, of seeing people at their most vulnerable and treating them with dignity. She looked at his ID badge again, then at her ruined umbrella, then back at him. The next few seconds stretched out like hours, filled only with the sound of rain and distant thunder. What happened next would challenge both their preconceptions and open the door to something neither of them expected. Sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come disguised as small moments, like a simple decision made at a rainy bus stop on an ordinary Tuesday night. The respiratory therapist took another look at her dead phone, then at the increasingly flooded street. A car drove past, splashing water onto the sidewalk, and she jumped back, clutching her broken umbrella. That seemed to help make up her mind. I live in the Pine Grove Apartments," she said, her voice carrying a mix of hesitation and hope. "It's not too far." She took a small step toward the car, then stopped again, her hands nervously adjusting her ID badge. The nurse nodded, keeping his movements calm and steady. "I know the place, just off Maple Street, right? About 10 minutes from here." He reached over and cleared some papers from the passenger seat, moving deliberately so she could see every action. "I'm heading that direction anyway." As she approached the car, he could see she was soaked through. Her light blue scrubs were several shades darker from the rain, and her hair was plastered to her face despite her earlier attempts to stay dry. She opened the door cautiously, placing her broken umbrella carefully on the floor. The car's interior light illuminated them both as she settled into the seat. There was an awkward moment as she fastened her seatbelt, both of them hyper-aware of being strangers in an enclosed space. The nurse turned up the heat, noticing her slight shiver. "Rough night to be stuck out here," he said, pulling carefully away from the curb. "The late buses are always unreliable in bad weather." He kept his tone conversational, professional, the same voice he used with nervous patients. She nodded, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Yeah, I usually drive, but my car's in the shop. The mechanic said it would be ready yesterday, but you know how that goes." A small laugh escaped her, slightly strained. "I thought I could manage with the bus for a few days." The wipers beat a steady rhythm as they drove through the empty streets. Rain transformed the city into a blur of reflected lights and shadows. Every few blocks, the flash of a street lamp would illuminate their faces, two healthcare workers making their way home after saving lives all day. She stole glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. He pretended not to notice, understanding that trust takes time to build. Instead, he pointed out his hospital ID badge again, making sure she could clearly see his department and role. "I think I've seen you around the 3rd floor," he said, stopping at a red light. Respiratory therapy, right? You folks have been incredibly busy since the flu season started. The mention of work seemed to ease some of her tension. Yeah, it's been nonstop. Today was especially challenging. We had 3 severe cases back to back. She paused, then added, "Actually, I think you might have been there for one of them." The young patient with the severe asthma attack. The nurse's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, the little girl with the purple backpack. That was a tough one. You did amazing work with her breathing treatments." He remembered how scared the child had been and how the respiratory therapist had gotten her to calm down by asking about her favorite cartoon characters. As they talked about their shared patient, something shifted in the car's atmosphere. The initial awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by the familiar camaraderie of healthcare workers who understood each other's world. They spoke the same language of caring, of night shifts and difficult cases, of small victories and heartbreaking losses. But just as they were starting to feel comfortable, something unexpected caught their attention through the rain-streaked windshield. The next few moments would test everything they knew about their professional training and human compassion. Neither of them could have predicted how this simple car ride would transform from a mere act of kindness into something much more significant. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the headlights swept across a scene that made both healthcare workers sit up straight. A car had swerved off the road, its front end crumpled against a light pole. Steam rose from the hood, mixing with the rain in an eerie dance. Without a word, they shared a look that only medical professionals would understand. The nurse carefully pulled over, putting on his hazard lights. "I've got my emergency kit in the trunk," he said, already reaching for his seatbelt. The respiratory therapist was looking intently at the crashed car, her earlier nervousness replaced by focused determination. "I'll check for breathing problems," she said firmly, her professional instincts taking over. All trace of their previous awkwardness vanished, replaced by the synchronized efficiency of 2 people who knew exactly what to do in a crisis. They ran through the rain together, their scrubs getting soaked again, but neither of them noticed. The nurse reached the driver's side first, while the respiratory therapist circled to the passenger side. The car's airbags had deployed, and 2 young people sat inside, dazed but conscious. "Hi there, we're healthcare workers," the nurse called out calmly, his voice carrying the same steadiness he used in the ER. "I'm a nurse, and my colleague here is a respiratory therapist. We're going to help you, okay?" The driver, a young man barely out of his teens, nodded slowly. "My sister," he mumbled, gesturing to the passenger side. "Is my sister okay?" The respiratory therapist was already checking the young woman's breathing. "She's alert and oriented," she called out, her trained hands moving with practiced precision, but her breathing sounds a bit labored. Possible airbag impact to the chest. They worked together as if they'd been partners for years, not strangers who met at a bus stop minutes ago. The nurse pulled his emergency kit from his car, grateful for his habit of always keeping it well stocked. As he checked the driver for injuries, the respiratory therapist talked softly to the sister, monitoring her breathing and keeping her calm. "The ambulance is on its way," called out a voice from behind them. An elderly man had stopped his car and called 911. More people were pulling over now, some holding umbrellas over the healthcare workers as they worked. The nurse and respiratory therapist established a seamless rhythm, exchanging information in the shorthand of medical professionals. "Pulse 92, responsive, pupils equal," he would say. "Respiratory rate 24, slight wheezing on the right side," she would respond. As they waited for the ambulance, they kept the siblings talking, asking about their plans for the holidays, their favorite movies, anything to keep them alert and distracted from the shock. The young man mentioned they were coming home from band practice. His sister managed a small smile when the respiratory therapist asked what instrument she played. "Saxophone," she whispered, then coughed slightly. Deep breaths, the respiratory therapist coached gently, her hands steady on the girl's shoulders. "Just like playing your sax, nice and slow." The nurse couldn't help but admire his colleague's technique. In the ER, he'd seen countless ways of calming patients, but connecting through their passions like this, it was masterful. Blue and red lights finally cut through the rain as emergency vehicles approached. The nurse and respiratory therapist gave their report to the arriving paramedics with professional precision. As the siblings were carefully loaded into the ambulance, the young man reached out and grabbed the nurse's hand. "Thank you," he said, his eyes clear and sincere. "Both of you. I don't know what would have happened if—" "You're going to be fine," the nurse assured him, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "You're in good hands now." As they watched the ambulance pull away, both healthcare workers stood in the rain, the adrenaline slowly fading. They looked at each other, really looked, for the first time since leaving the hospital. Something profound had shifted between them, something that went beyond the usual barriers of race, gender, and stranger anxiety. The respiratory therapist smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "That was some amazing teamwork," she said softly. "I guess sometimes the universe knows what it's doing, even on rainy nights at bus stops." The nurse smiled back, feeling a deep sense of connection that only comes from facing a crisis together. As they walked back to his car, both soaked but somehow lighter, they knew this night would change more than just their own perspectives. But neither of them could have guessed just how far-reaching those changes would be. Back in the warmth of the car, both healthcare workers sat quietly for a moment, processing what had just happened. Their scrubs were completely soaked now, and the nurse turned up the heat even higher. The clock on the dashboard showed it was almost 1 a.m. "You know," the respiratory therapist said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I almost didn't accept your offer for a ride." She was looking straight ahead, her voice thoughtful. "And if I hadn't, we wouldn't have been here to help those kids." The nurse nodded, understanding the weight of what she wasn't saying. "Life's funny that way, isn't it? One small decision can change everything." He pulled carefully back onto the road, windshield wipers working steadily against the continuing rain. As they drove, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small pack of tissues, wiping rainwater from her face. "Can I be completely honest with you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of shame. "When you first stopped at the bus stop, I had all these thoughts in my head, all these stupid prejudices I was raised with." The nurse kept his eyes on the road, but a small, knowing smile crossed his face. "About a black man offering help at night." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I feel terrible about it now, especially after seeing you work. The way you handled those kids, how calm you kept everyone. I've seen experienced doctors get flustered in situations like that." "Hey," he said gently, "don't beat yourself up. We all grow up with certain ideas in our heads. What matters is being willing to challenge them." He paused at a red light, remembering something. "You know what's ironic? I almost didn't stop because I was worried about how it might look, a man offering a ride to a woman at night. We both let fear almost stop us from doing the right thing." The light turned green, and they continued through the empty streets. The rain had finally begun to ease, leaving behind a misty calm. Emergency vehicles' lights still flashed in the distance behind them, a reminder of what they'd just experienced. "My grandmother," the nurse continued, "she always used to say that fear and prejudice are like dark rooms. The only way to deal with them is to turn on the light and see what's really there." He chuckled softly. Of course, she'd usually say this while forcing me to check under my bed for monsters when I was 6. The respiratory therapist laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the car. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past. "You know what amazes me? How quickly everything changed back there. 1 minute we're basically strangers, feeling awkward and unsure, and the next minute we're working together like we've done it for years," he finished. "That's the thing about healthcare, it strips away all the superficial stuff. When someone needs help, nothing else matters except doing what needs to be done." They turned onto a quieter street, the one leading to her apartment complex. Both of them felt a strange reluctance to have the night end, knowing something important had happened, something that went beyond just helping accident victims. "I keep thinking about those kids," she said softly. "The way the brother kept checking on his sister, even though he was hurt himself. How she used her saxophone breathing exercises to stay calm. Sometimes you see the best of humanity in the worst moments." The nurse thought about his own sister, how protective he felt of her. "Those kids showed real strength tonight. And you know what? I have a feeling they're going to have an amazing story to tell their friends about how 2 random healthcare workers appeared out of nowhere in the rain to help them." As they approached her apartment building, neither of them could have predicted how this shared experience would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their own. The night had more surprises in store, and the biggest revelation was yet to come, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about coincidences and fate. The car pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Grove Apartments, coming to a gentle stop under a flickering street lamp. The rain had finally settled into a light drizzle, and the sound of distant thunder had faded away. As the nurse put the car in park, the respiratory therapist suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness," she said, her eyes wide with recognition. "I just realized something. That little girl today, the one with asthma, she was wearing a purple backpack with a saxophone pin on it." The nurse turned to her, puzzled at first, then his eyes widened too. "Wait, you don't think?" She was the same girl. The sister from the accident. I knew her voice sounded familiar. She was our patient this morning. The respiratory therapist shook her head in amazement. She must have been coming home from band practice, just like her brother said. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing this incredible coincidence. Earlier that day, they had helped a young girl breathe through a severe asthma attack. Now, by pure chance, they had been there to help her again after the accident. "That's why your breathing exercises worked so well with her," the nurse said softly. "She already trusted you from this morning. And that's why she was so calm. She recognized us both." The respiratory therapist wiped away a tear that had suddenly appeared. "You know what this means, right? If we hadn't stopped to help her this morning, if you hadn't offered me a ride tonight, if I hadn't accepted." "Everything's connected," the nurse finished, his voice full of wonder. "My grandmother used to say there's no such thing as coincidence, just stories we don't understand yet." She turned to face him fully now, her earlier fears completely forgotten. "I need to tell you something. When I first started working at the hospital, I was raised in a small town. My parents had some pretty backwards views about people who were different from us. I thought I'd moved past all that, but tonight showed me I still had some learning to do." The nurse listened quietly, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. She continued, "When you stopped to help me, all those old prejudices came rushing back. But then I saw your hospital ID, and I remembered seeing you in the ER. The way you handled that difficult patient last week, how gentle you were with the scared kids, how the other nurses respect you." She took a deep breath. "I almost let fear and stupid prejudices stop me from accepting help from one of the kindest people I've ever met. And if I had, those kids, that little girl we helped twice in one day, who knows what would have happened?" The nurse felt the weight of her words, understanding the courage it took to admit these things. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "growth isn't about never having those thoughts. It's about what we choose to do with them. You chose to trust, to learn, to change. That's what matters." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft patter of drizzle on the car roof. The digital clock now showed 1:30 a.m., but neither felt tired anymore. Something profound had happened this night, something that went beyond helping accident victims or overcoming prejudices. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked suddenly. "Because I'm starting to think this wasn't just about giving me a ride home. Maybe we were meant to be there for that family. Maybe." She trailed off as her phone suddenly came back to life, having gathered enough charge from the car's USB port. Messages started popping up on her screen, including one from the hospital. As she read it, her face broke into a smile that lit up the entire car. What she saw on that screen would lead to changes neither of them could have imagined. Changes that would ripple through their hospital and beyond, touching countless lives in unexpected ways. But first, she had to share what the message said, and why it made this night even more extraordinary than they already knew. The respiratory therapist's hands shook slightly as she read the message from the hospital. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "The hospital just sent out an emergency alert. They're looking for staff willing to start a night shift transportation program. Apparently, one of our nurses was attacked at the bus stop last week, and administration finally decided to do something about it." The nurse leaned back in his seat, taking in this information. "That's why there were so many meetings in HR lately. I heard some staff had been complaining about unsafe commutes, especially during night shifts. But here's the incredible part," she continued, scrolling through the message. "They're asking for volunteers to help organize it. They need people who understand both the medical field and transportation safety concerns. She looked up at him, eyes bright with possibility. We should do this together. He thought about all the times he'd seen colleagues waiting at bus stops, about the young nurse who was attacked, about tonight's chance encounter that led to saving 2 young lives. You know what? You're right, we should. What happened next would transform their hospital community in ways no one could have predicted. The next morning, despite their lack of sleep, both of them showed up early to submit their proposal. They shared their experience from the previous night, how a simple act of kindness had enabled them to save lives, how it had broken down barriers of prejudice and fear. Their story spread through the hospital like wildfire. Other staff members came forward with their own experiences, their own fears and concerns about late-night commutes. The administration, moved by the overwhelming response, fast-tracked the program's approval. Within a month, they had set up a volunteer driver network of hospital staff. It wasn't just about transportation, it was about building a stronger, safer community. The respiratory therapist used her experience to help others overcome their initial hesitations, while the nurse's calm professionalism set the standard for volunteer drivers. The program created unexpected connections throughout the hospital. Surgeons gave rides to cleaning staff, nurses carpooled with lab technicians, and slowly the invisible barriers between departments began to fade. People who had worked in the same building for years finally started talking, sharing stories, becoming friends. But the most remarkable story came 3 weeks after that rainy night. The young saxophone player and her brother visited the hospital, not as patients, but as volunteers. They had recovered fully and wanted to give back. The girl now played her saxophone in the children's ward, using her music to help young patients with their breathing exercises, just as she had done during her own recovery. Her brother, inspired by the healthcare workers who helped them, started taking pre-med courses at the local community college. That night showed me what it means to be there for others, he told them. How something as simple as stopping to help can change lives. The respiratory therapist and nurse remained close friends, that unlikely partnership becoming a symbol of what could happen when people chose trust over fear. They never forgot that rainy night, how close they both came to letting prejudice and fear win. Instead, they had chosen courage, chosen to see beyond their initial judgments, and that choice had rippled outward in ways they could never have imagined. 1 year later, their program had spread to 3 other hospitals in the city. The local news did a story about it, interviewing staff members whose lives had been touched by the initiative. It's more than just rides, one nurse explained. It's about looking out for each other, about remembering we're all human, all connected. The respiratory therapist often thought back to that rainy night, to her moment of hesitation at the bus stop. Sometimes the scariest choices lead to the most beautiful changes, she would say during program orientation sessions. Sometimes the people we're taught to fear turn out to be the ones who change our lives for the better. And the nurse? He kept his grandmother's photo on his desk, her words about kindness and fear now printed beneath it, inspiring new volunteers. Fear can make us forget our humanity, but every time we choose kindness over fear, we make the world a little bit better. Their story became more than just a tale of a ride home on a rainy night. It became a reminder that change starts with individual choices, that trust can break down walls, and that sometimes the most powerful way to fight prejudice is simply to be kind, to be present, to be human. The hospital's culture had shifted. People looked out for each other more, checked on their colleagues, offered help without being asked. And on rainy nights, when staff members waited for their rides home, they would remember the story that started it all, about a nurse who chose to stop, a respiratory therapist who chose to trust, and how those choices created ripples of change that would touch countless lives for years to come.